It had been a long season, the kind that leaves your body heavy and your spirit quiet. For Giannis, the summer meant silence, not just the absence of screaming crowds or the weightless hush after a buzzer beater. This was a deeper kind of silence, the kind that comes when the world stops watching, and all that remains are the people who knew you before the cameras. He returned to Athens quietly, just as he'd left it years ago. No fanfare, no headlines. The family apartment hadn't changed much. The walls were still pale, the kitchen still small, the windows still let in too much sun in the late afternoon. But it was home, not the kind measured by square footage or luxury, but by the stories etched into its corners. The floor where he'd learned to dribble, the couch where they used to pile up, 5 deep, watching games on a TV with fuzzy reception, the little balcony where his mother once dried clothes under a sky that always felt too big for how small they lived. Veronica greeted him with the same tired, radiant eyes. She had always looked like someone who carried a storm and a prayer in the same breath. She hugged him tight, her fingers gripping his back as though still afraid he might vanish. And he let her. No resistance, no pride. Just a son returning to the arms of the only certainty he'd ever known. The days passed slowly. Meals were long and simple. Conversations meandered. The brothers came and went, loud and laughing. But beneath the warmth there was a hum Giannis couldn't name, a quiet tension that pulsed just beneath the calm. Veronica smiled easily, but there were moments, brief, blinking moments, when her gaze drifted somewhere far. And when it returned, she was just a second too slow to catch the rhythm of the present. It was one of those nights, warm, uneventful, when the silence finally cracked. They were at the kitchen table, a modest dinner, half finished. Giannis leaned back in his chair, spinning a piece of bread in his fingers. He was telling a story from when he was maybe 8 or 9, one of those absurd memories only children could make epic. A day they'd chased after a street dog thinking it was a wolf, screaming through alleyways, hearts pounding, only to realize it was just a shaggy mutt missing a tail. Everyone laughed, even Veronica. But her laugh, it broke halfway through. Just slightly, like a string pulled too tight. She lowered her eyes. Her fingers, busy folding a napkin, suddenly stopped moving. Giannis caught it. He knew that look. "Mama?" he asked gently. "You okay?" She nodded too quickly. "Of course, baby. Just tired." But the room had shifted. He knew it. She knew it. "You always do that," he said softly. "Do what?" "That thing. When I bring up those days, you always get quiet." Veronica said nothing, just stared at the napkin in her hand, like it might give her a way out. Giannis leaned forward. "Was it worse than we thought, back then?" She took a breath, shallow, short. Her shoulders lifted slightly, then fell. "I think it's time you knew," she said, barely above a whisper. "All of it." Giannis blinked. The room felt smaller. "Know what?" Veronica stood slowly. She walked to the kitchen door and called out to the other boys, asking for a moment alone. One by one, they filtered out, casting confused glances. The door closed behind them with a soft click. Just mother and son now. She didn't sit, just stood there for a moment back to the table, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter. When she turned around, her eyes were already shining with unshed tears. "You remember how hard those years were," she began. "No papers, no job security, no safety. Every time we stepped outside, I prayed we wouldn't be noticed. But you always smiled. You were so full of life even then. You didn't know how dangerous it all was." Giannis nodded, silent. "There's something I never told you," she continued. "Because I was ashamed, because I was scared, and because I didn't want to see your heart break when you were too young to put it back together." She paused. Then, slowly, she sat. "There was a man," she said. "He worked with social services, unofficially. A volunteer, they said. But really, he was just a gatekeeper. The kind of man who smiled at you while counting your flaws. He came to our church sometimes, asking questions, pretending to help. One day he asked to speak to me privately. Her voice trembled now. Giannis barely breathed. He said there was a family, a white Greek family, wealthy, influential. They wanted to adopt a child, a black child specifically. For the optics, he said. Progressive, charitable. Those were his words. Giannis's jaw tensed. He looked at me and said, "You have too many. You can't give them all a future. Let one go, just one. It would make things easier for everyone." Giannis felt something cold crawl up his spine. Veronica met his eyes. Her next words landed like bricks. "He pointed to you." A silence fell so thick it swallowed the room. "He said you were the most adaptable, that you smiled easily, that you'd assimilate well. Like you were a pet, Giannis, like you were something they could train." He didn't speak. He couldn't. "I told him no," she said. "Of course I did. I told him I'd rather die. But he came back, more than once. Told me there would be consequences, that my refusal could hurt the others, that if I didn't cooperate, they might come and take someone anyway." Giannis's hands were clenched tight now, his knuckles pale. "I didn't sleep for weeks. I'd sit by the door with a knife. I made your brothers sleep in shifts, so someone was always watching. Every knock, every siren, I thought it was them." Tears slid silently down her cheeks. "I never told you. I couldn't. You were just a boy, and you looked up to everyone. I didn't want to poison your innocence." Finally, Giannis spoke, his voice low and cracking. "They were going to take me away." She nodded. "They tried." He stood abruptly, the chair sliding back. He paced to the window, pressed his palms against the frame, breathing hard. "All this time," he whispered, "all this time I thought we were just poor, just struggling. I didn't know we were being hunted." Veronica came to him, placed a hand on his shoulder. "You weren't supposed to know because you needed to be free to dream. I didn't want your memories stained with fear." He turned to her then, and his eyes, those fierce, determined eyes, were glassy with tears. "You saved me," he said. "I protected my son," she replied. Giannis collapsed into her arms, no longer the giant of the court, but a child once more. He sobbed against her shoulder, deep, guttural sobs, for the life he almost lost, for the love that shielded him, for the story that had lived in silence for too long. And in that kitchen, with its flickering light and chipped countertops, something broke open between them. Not just pain, but trust. A truth finally spoken. A bond reforged in fire and grace. The past had finally come to light, and nothing would ever feel the same again. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Giannis lay awake in the room he'd once shared with his brothers, the ceiling above him casting familiar shadows. But everything felt different now. The walls, the floor, even the air itself seemed changed, as if they too had heard what Veronica had said and were struggling to absorb it. The image wouldn't leave him. A stranger in a button shirt and plastic smile pointing at him, suggesting he be handed off like an extra suitcase. "He assimilates well." That phrase haunted him. It wasn't just offensive. It was annihilating. A judgment on his soul disguised as a compliment. He had grown up thinking the danger was poverty, deportation, hunger. But this was something deeper. The danger had a face, a name, a decision that had come down to someone else's calculation of value. He sat up in bed, his breath tight. The room swam in darkness, but his thoughts moved faster than light. It wasn't just what happened. It was how close he had come to never knowing. How close he had come to being taken from the only home that had ever mattered. In the early hours, he walked quietly to the kitchen. The fridge light bathed the space in a soft glow. He didn't eat, just stood there, leaning against the counter, staring at nothing. The silence was weighty again, but now it hummed with echoes. Behind him, a quiet shuffle. Veronica. She stood there in her robe, her hands clasped in front of her, eyes calm but tired. She didn't ask what he was doing up. She knew. "You remember," she said softly. "That week we didn't go outside at all, not even to the market." He nodded. "We thought it was because of the police raids." "I told you it was, but it wasn't," she said. "It was because they said they'd come back with paperwork, said they had a legal route to do it. I didn't know if it was true, but I couldn't risk it." Giannis looked at her, her frame smaller now than he remembered, but still full of that fierce gravity she always carried. "You really believed they might just come and take me?" he asked. "I didn't believe," she said. "I knew they could. We didn't exist on paper, no rights, no protection. You were a black boy in a country that never wanted to understand your smile. And I was a mother with no shield except love." He swallowed hard. His voice cracked. "What would have happened if you hadn't said no?" Veronica took a breath. Her lips trembled. "They would have taken you, given you a new name, a new school. Maybe you'd have learned the piano, had a nanny, but you wouldn't have had your brothers or me, you wouldn't have had us. And I wouldn't have remembered. They would have made sure of that." The weight of those words sat on him like stone. He imagined that version of himself, a kid growing up in a different house, a different neighborhood, maybe even smiling in photos that didn't belong to his real life, a stranger to his own story, a life built on stolen foundation. "But I would have still been me, right?" he asked, uncertain. Veronica stepped forward. Her answer came without hesitation. "No," she said. "They would have erased the parts of you that made you ours. You don't grow roots in soil that denies your name." Giannis exhaled sharply, the sound too close to a sob. He leaned forward, resting his head against the top of her shoulder like he used to do as a child. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I had no idea." "I know," she said. "That was the point." They stood there in silence for a long time, the kind that speaks louder than any sentence, the kind that only exists between people who've shared both terror and tenderness. In the days that followed, the air in the house changed. Not heavier, not exactly lighter either, but deeper, fuller, like the silence had been replaced by something honest. Giannis didn't talk about it with his brothers right away. It felt too sacred, too fragile. But his relationship with his mother shifted in quiet ways. He watched her more closely now, noticed the things he had once taken for granted, the way she always sat facing the door, how she always walked slightly behind when they were in public, scanning, ready. Every act of love she'd made now seemed threaded with deeper meaning. He remembered a day when he was little, maybe 5, when Veronica had pulled him into the apartment in a rush. No explanation, just urgency. She'd closed all the curtains and locked the door, then sat beside him on the floor, holding him close until his breathing slowed. At the time, he thought maybe she'd been scared of a storm. But now he knew. The storm had been a man in a suit with a clipboard and a hollow smile. He told her this one morning over coffee. She nodded. "I remember. I saw him talking to a neighbor. He didn't see me, but I couldn't take the chance." He looked down at his cup, the steam rising. "I used to think you were paranoid," he admitted. "I was," she said, "but only because they gave me a reason to be." There was no bitterness in her voice, no anger, just memory. Later that week, Giannis took a walk through the old neighborhood, alone. He passed the bakery where they used to beg for leftover bread, the alley where he and Thanasis once hid from a pair of boys yelling slurs. He passed a playground where no one had ever invited him to play. It all looked smaller now, but the shadows felt bigger. At the edge of the park, he sat on a bench and took out his phone. For a moment, he just stared at the screen. Then, slowly, he opened the Notes app and began to type. Not to post, not yet, but just to see the truth written plainly. "My mother almost lost me because someone thought poverty was justification for possession. Because I was black, poor, and undocumented, they thought I could be bought. I was 6. They thought she would give me up. They were wrong." He stared at the words, the air around him stilled. Then came another thought, one that felt even heavier. I was almost given a different name, a different family, a different life. That Giannis would have played basketball maybe, would have had food and clothes and safety, but he wouldn't have known what love means when it fights. That Giannis would have had a bed, but not a mother who watched the door all night. That Giannis wouldn't have been me. He closed the app, let the phone drop to his lap, and he cried. not in anger, not even in pain. He cried for a boy who almost never knew what home was, for a mother who bore the weight of his ignorance so that he could believe in light, for the innocence stolen from families like his, every day quietly across the world. When he returned home that evening, he found Veronica in the living room, folding laundry like nothing had changed, but everything had. He walked over, took the shirt from her hands and folded it himself. She looked at him confused. "I'm not letting you do this alone anymore," he said. Veronica didn't smile, but her eyes softened. She touched his face and nodded. Later that night, as the house fell quiet again, Giannis sat in his room and opened a blank email. He began to type, "Dear team, there's something I need to talk about. It's not about basketball. It's about who I almost wasn't." He didn't know where it would lead yet, whether he'd post it, speak it, or keep it between them, but the silence had broken. The wound had been opened, yes, but it had also begun to heal, not in forgetting, but in remembering fully, in facing what had almost been erased. And for the first time in years, Giannis didn't feel like he was running from the past. He was walking toward it. The world didn't stop spinning, even as something fundamental shifted inside him. In the days that followed the revelation, Giannis moved through life with a strange mix of heaviness and clarity. Every gesture from his mother now carried layers he hadn't seen before. Every mundane moment felt like a thread woven into something sacred. He found himself pausing more often, in the middle of a walk, over a meal, during phone calls with teammates, as if the air had thickened with meaning. The memory of that man, that offer, that possibility, haunted him. Not like a nightmare, but like an alternate life just barely avoided, its shadow brushing against his own. He didn't tell anyone publicly. Not yet. Not his coaches. Not the media. Not the fans who followed his every move like it was scripture. This wasn't for headlines, it was for understanding, for reckoning, and maybe eventually for healing. But even without speaking it out loud, his body spoke for him. On the court, in those rare off-season workouts, he was sharper, quieter, focused in a way his trainer couldn't quite explain. There was a tension to his motion, not anger but urgency. Each shot, each sprint, each rep carried the weight of something deeply personal. He wasn't just chasing greatness anymore, he was honoring survival. One afternoon he found himself at a community center in Athens, a small place, no logos, no photographers. Just kids, dozens of them, some Greek, some African, some in between, running around with basketballs too big for their hands and dreams too big for their walls. Giannis watched from the sidelines at first, smiling, but his smile wavered when he saw a young boy get pushed aside during a drill. He didn't cry, didn't complain. He just stepped back, quiet, and let the others pass him. Something inside Giannis twisted. He walked over, knelt beside the boy, and asked his name. The kid looked up at him like one might look at a statue that suddenly moved. "Youssef," the boy said quietly. Giannis nodded. "You like basketball, Youssef?" The boy shrugged. "I guess." "You're good at it," Giannis said, even though he hadn't seen him shoot once. Youssef glanced at the floor. "I don't get the ball much." Giannis placed a hand on his shoulder. "You will." That evening, he sat with the center's director, a woman who had been running the place for 2 decades. They talked about funding, staff shortages, kids falling through the cracks. And slowly, without fanfare, Giannis made a promise. Not with money, though he offered that too, but with presence. He would show up. Not as the NBA superstar, not as a brand, just as Giannis. As a boy who had once been forgotten. As a man who almost never got to remember where he came from. That night, back at his mother's home, he sat on the floor of the living room, flipping through an old album Veronica had dug out from the closet. The photos were faded, some barely legible, but the feeling was vivid. There was a shot of him with Thanasis, both shirtless, holding plastic bottles like trophies. Another of Veronica laughing with her head thrown back, a rare expression caught on film. He lingered on a photo of himself, maybe 5 years old, sitting on the stairs, his knees scraped, his eyes wide and uncertain. He touched the edge of the photo with his thumb, tracing the shape of a boy who didn't know how close he'd come to vanishing into someone else's life. "I think I want to tell the story," he said aloud, not looking up. Veronica, seated nearby, didn't ask which story. She already knew. "I want people to hear it," he continued. "Not to feel sorry, but to understand, to really understand." She watched him quietly. Then, with that same fierce softness she always carried, she nodded. "Then tell it," she said. "It's yours now." He didn't go to the press. He didn't wait for the playoffs. He didn't schedule a press conference or craft a PR statement. One morning, sitting at the table where the truth had first been spoken, he took out his phone and began to record. No script, no lighting, just his voice, just the truth. He spoke slowly, carefully. He spoke about being 6, about the man with the offer. He spoke about his mother's fear, her defiance, her courage, about how close he had come to losing everything he was before he even knew who he could become. He didn't cry, not this time. But his voice cracked once, and that single break said more than tears could. He ended the video simply, "This is my story. Not because I want it to be special, but because I know it's not. There are kids like me everywhere, mothers like mine. They just don't have a stage, so I'm using mine for them." He posted the video without fanfare. Within hours, it spread. Millions of views. News outlets picked it up. Commentators reacted. Fans flooded the comments with support and heartbreak and shared stories. But the most powerful responses came from people who weren't looking for the spotlight. Immigrants, refugees, mothers, sons, who saw themselves reflected in his voice. Messages poured in. Not just thanks, but revelations. "I thought I was alone. This happened to my cousin. Now I understand my mother better." It became more than a video. It became a mirror. In the weeks that followed, Giannis partnered with organizations that supported undocumented families. He funded legal clinics. He helped create spaces for parents to tell their stories without fear. He did it all quietly, insisting that the focus stay on the families, not the star athlete behind them. But the story stayed with him. One day, walking through the narrow streets of his old neighborhood, he passed a woman sitting outside her store. She looked up and smiled at him like she knew him, not as a celebrity, but as a neighbor, as one of theirs. He stopped. "You remember me?" he asked. She nodded. "You used to run barefoot past my shop every day." He smiled. "Your mother used to scare me," the woman added with a chuckle. "Always looked like she was ready to fight the whole world." Giannis laughed, then looked off into the distance. She was. He returned home that evening, and for the first time in years, asked his mother if she wanted to go for a walk. Just the two of them. They walked slowly, side by side, past the buildings that once felt too tall, down the alleyways that once felt like mazes. The sun was setting, casting long shadows, turning the pavement gold. Children ran past them. Cars honked in the distance. Life moved on. But in that moment, time folded. Giannis reached for her hand, the same hand that had once held him through fear, through hunger, through decisions that no one should have to make. "I owe you everything," he said. She squeezed his hand. "You owe me nothing," she said. "Just live well. That's enough." He looked at her, the woman who had hidden terror in her silence, who had given him not just life, but story, purpose, truth. "You're my first championship," he whispered. She didn't reply. She didn't have to. They kept walking, the city behind them, the world before them, not as survivor and saved, but as two people who had weathered the storm together, as proof that love, real love, is not a story of perfection, but one of resistance, quiet, relentless, unshakable. And so they walked, through the streets that once threatened to erase them, now standing tall side by side in the full light of their history. Together, still whole, still home.